Tea is an interesting beverage.
Tea time.
Tea is arguably the most consumed beverage in the world. Now, there's no way to say that with the kind of certainty that this National Geographic piece gives us. I've tried to look up statistics measuring the exact consumption habits of drinking people around the world, which suffice it to say is impossible. We do, however, have articles like this one from Statista, which basically say big numbers, big charts. So there you go. Naturally, tea is also a big part of our culture. If you look on this very website, tea will give you a bunch of results, some about the beverage I'm consuming, but also a lot about gossip. Tea is a slang term that derives, of course, like any other Gen Z slang, from Black ballroom culture, which essentially can mean gossip. At least nowadays, that's what it means. But it's also pretty typical that this meaning is a bit distorted from the original meaning. A Merriam-Webster article notes that the term has roots dating back to at least the year 1993. That year, a book came out called Murder in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Berendt, in which the author at one point interviews the transgender performer, the Lady Chablis, who tells the author,
"When black boys find out my tea, honey, they be ready to kick my ass." "Your tea?" "Yeah, my tea. My thing, my business. What's going on in my life?"
Now, as Berendt does here in Lady Chablis' own autobiography, she writes it as T, like the letter T, rather than the word TEA. And she gives it an acronymic definition. You know, my T, my truth. But the double meaning of T as a letter and as a word has had a presence within Black queer vernacular for a really long time. In One of the Children, an ethnography of identity and gay Black men, William G. Hawkeswood quotes a young man named Nate as saying,
"I stand on the sidelines and watch these people. They're so entertaining. Straight life must be so boring because everyone conforms. These gay kids carry on. They give you the wrong colors at the wrong time. They give you dance and great tea. And their whole delivery is not how men are supposed to do it."
This kind of fluidity, irony, and plurality of meaning is pretty much an extension of the presence of these kinds of things within Black queer ballroom culture in general. It is also a classic example of how underclasses will forge their own cultural staples, their own languages, their own meanings and art forms. And then upper classes, middle classes will reappropriate those terms because they find within it some sliver of identity, something so audacious or interesting or just truthful about existence that they're not as easily able to name and deal with because they're so systemically sheltered from it. In response, the underclasses have to find new forms of expression and the cycle continues. And there's something to the idea of tea and class, right? And the ideas of multiple meanings, pluralities of meanings and pluralities of emotions, these experiences that are both rooted in terrible oppression and trying to find some type of expression within that, but also things that eventually can be integrated and celebrated and shared, but not shared, happy, but not happy. Anyway, let's talk about tea.
I like to cha-cha.
So tea is two things, actually. It is both a drink, which is, I have the drink, it's tea. But it's also tea in the other sense, which is tea proper, or tea made from the tea plant. Technically, anything used with the tea plant is tea because that's what the tea plant is. It's tea. We're starting off really well. The plant is called Camellia sinensis. It grows in this area stretching across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. At least it was indigenous to those parts of the world, we think. Now it grows everywhere. All of the major tea types use Camellia sinensis leaves. That includes what I'm drinking here, which is green tea. It also includes black tea, yellow tea, pu'er tea. In other words, this is the main character. This is the main girl. She is played by Audrey Hepburn. She is played by Meryl Streep. Now, why is Camellia sinensis the main tea plant? Well, it's an etymological thing, which we'll get into. But also, just to say why it's popular, it has a lot of caffeine in it, basically. Humans throughout history, especially ancient history, have always tried to figure out what has caffeine, what's got the good energy stuff in it, and what doesn't. This is probably because we've been tired a lot. Working a lot. Other examples of this include the kola nut, which grows within parts of West Africa and Nigeria. It's a very popular thing to consume traditionally. And there's also coffee. You might have heard of that, and other types of plants that will have caffeine, again, or similar properties. In general, humans are always interested in finding out what leaves do what. Some time ago, people were just picking up leaves, pulling them off of plants, chewing them, going, it tastes like shit, because they always taste like shit. And then kind of figuring out whether or not they were toxic and going to kill them or going to have some sort of potential medicinal properties, which is often very interpretive. And the ones that had caffeine were the winners. They were the ones that people consumed a lot. The one I'm drinking right now, by the way, is decaffeinated because it's 11 o'clock at night. Decaffeination process is something that occurs in multiple different ways. You generally are going to see caffeine extracted from tea leaves through some sort of water process. There's a couple of different processes. It's a bit controversial. Either way, caffeine's not really great for me anyway. I'm bouncing all over the walls all the time. Now, China has essentially been the civilization tied to tea from its inception. It's been the tea country. The Ba people, who settled in eastern Sichuan some 3,000 years ago or so, are the first people who have been on written record as having consumed tea. Moe and Mair's book, The True History of Tea, notes that the first recorded gazetteer in the history of China, the Chronicles of Huayang, notes that the Ba gave in tributes to the Zhou people, among many materials, a vegetable denoted with the character that's pronounced tu in modern Chinese. I don't think you can verbalize what characters look like, which differs from the acknowledged character for tea, cha, in modern Chinese, that's cha in Mandarin, only by a single horizontal stroke. The question of whether or not the first character represents an old form of the current one, and thus if it was really tea that the Ba presented to the Zhou, has vexed generations of Chinese etymologists, and bedevils the study of Chinese tea history all the way up to the Tang Dynasty. Cha would become the Chinese word for tea, that's the Mandarin version, and would become the etymological root for the word for tea in basically every language, with a couple of exceptions. In Burmese, because Myanmar, Burma, is one of the areas in which the tea plant grows indigenously, they have their own different word for tea. They say letpet or lapet. I don't know how it's really pronounced, but that's how it is reading in romanization. And they actually use it for a lot of different culinary purposes besides making tea. Namely, they use it in pickled form. They pickle it and make like a little salad out of it, pair it with meat. Sounds really good to me. One notable version of these words for tea is outlined by Nakhil Sanad for quartz, where tea was brought to Central Asia, eventually becoming chai in Persian. That is no doubt due to the trade routes of the Silk Road, along which, according to a recent discovery, tea was traded over 2,000 years ago. This form spread beyond Persia, becoming chai in Urdu, shai in Arabic, and chai in Russian, among others. It even made its way to sub-Saharan Africa, where it became chai in Swahili. The Japanese and Korean terms for tea are also based on the Chinese cha, though those languages likely adopted the word even before its westward spread into Persian. Confusingly enough, this is also where the word tea comes from. Yes, tea and cha and chai, same root, because in coastal Minnan Chinese, they would actually pronounce the same character as de or ti, I believe. The main Dutch ports in East Asia were in Fujian and Taiwan, both places where people used the te pronunciation. The Dutch East India Company's expansive tea importation into Europe gave us the French te, the German tea, and the English tea. If that wasn't the correct German pronunciation, I'm sorry. De in Spanish too, de. Hey, it's Elliot from the future, straight from the gym. And today I want to talk to you about today's sponsor. Our sponsors are very important to what we do, and I'm very excited to announce that today's sponsor is Lingoda. Lingoda is an online language school that provides 24/7 live classes, both in a group setting and one-on-one. Lingoda is flexible. It offers 550K classes per year. That means over 60 classes start every hour around the clock. The curricula is well structured, you get all the resources you need, and you have great native level speakers that are able to converse with you and challenge you in the language while also helping you out. For me, I've always found language learning to be one of the coolest and most important things. In my whole family, we've always prized the idea that one of us can learn how to speak not just Spanish and English, because most of my family, basically all of my family, is from the Dominican Republic. And so I'm learning French, and Lingoda is a great resource for me. Look, this is how you say French East India Company. Compagnie Française pour le Commerce des Indes Orientales. Not bad. One day I have the goal of surprising my family by showing them that I've learned another language, which will make them very, very proud, and also I think is very important as far as learning about histories of peoples around the world. Lingoda also offers something called sprints. They're 2-month learning challenges where you can take lessons intensively and see big progress quickly. There's a sprint, 15 classes per month, or the super sprints, 30 classes per month. And if you finish the sprint challenge, you can earn 50% of your money back or more free classes. I know a lot of you have big and awesome language goals, and Lingoda may be the thing for you to utilize on that journey. So click the link below for more information and use my code ELLIOT20, that's ELLIOT 20, for 20 euros or $25 off of your sprint registration. Lingoda is Lingoted. Let's go! Thank you to Lingoda for sponsoring. The Chinese have a foundational myth about tea, as any good civilization does about things that have existed in it for a long time. It stars the mythical ruler Shen Nong, otherwise known as the divine farmer, the guy who is the god of agriculture, basically, for the Chinese. Mo and Mair tell it this way. In China, there is an apocryphal story, often bandied about as history, according to which the mythical Shen Nong, divine farmer, China's second emperor and first agriculturalist, who is alleged to have ruled from 2737 to 2698 BC, tasted 100 plants. Some 72 of them, a magic number throughout Eurasia, made him ill. Only one cured him of these illnesses, the tea plant. Tea found its way into becoming a significant part of more southern Chinese diets. Particularly, it served as an alternative to rice-based alcohols, which is particularly good for the Buddhist monks who are not supposed to drink that stuff. Mo and Mair write, during the rule of the usurper princess Wu Zetian, Buddhism enjoyed unprecedented imperial patronage in China, while systematically killing off her political opponents. Very Buddhist. Wu Zetian built huge Buddhist temples in Chang'an, and in a special display of her pious fervor, issued a nationwide edict prohibiting the consumption of meat and fish, which remained in effect for 8 years. By this time, tea had become an integral part in the lives of Buddhist monks, who were not allowed to drink alcohol or eat solid food after noon. The monks cultivated tea, drank it for meditation while studying and during ceremonies, offered tea to the Buddha, presented it as a gift to visitors, sold it, and sent it as a tribute to the imperial court, which in turn reciprocated. When the emperor Daizong convened Buddhist monks at his palace to write a new commentary to the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, a codification of monastic rules, he provided them with paper, ink, a 90-day supply of vegetarian food, and 25 strings of tea. This is how people have been offering each other gifts on Discords for many, many years since. Eventually, the northern part of China would catch on to tea after a while, after the unification of China over the next few dynasties, and the eventuation of shipping tea across China. And it became a cornerstone of cultural ennoblement in China, something that scholars and politicians would use to sort of curry favor. They would consume it, they loved it, they praised it, they wrote poetry about it, and they used it to also fend off forces from the outside that were trying to take over those parts of China. To varying degrees of success, there was a period of time when China and Tibet had a tea and horse trade because China didn't have good horses for war or something like that. Mo and Mair says that this worked for a while, but in the end it was doomed to failure as the nomads' craving for tea proved stronger than the emperor's ability to maintain and police his monopoly. Meanwhile, let's say this is around 1000 AD. In late 12th century, early 13th century Japan, they started picking up on tea after a very tumultuous period. Zen Buddhists, especially the monk Eisai, saw tea as this way in which Japanese people could cure their ills and shortcomings. He would say that Japanese cuisine was deficient in bitter flavors. It was too much salty and sweet and sour and all over the place. He once wrote, "I wonder why the Japanese do not care for bitter things. In the great country of China, they drink tea, as a result of which there is no heart trouble and people live long lives. Our country is full of sickly-looking, skinny people, and this is simply because we do not drink tea. Whenever one is in poor spirits, one should drink tea. This will put the heart in good order and dispel all illness." And from this emerges chanoyu, or the Japanese tea ceremony. The tea used in traditional Japanese tea ceremonies is matcha, which you can now get at like Starbucks and other tea shops and mix it with a bunch of cream and sugar and it tastes really good. I think people put it in like donuts and stuff too. But it also, in its most traditional and finely graded form, is one of the most traditional things in Japanese culinary history. It was really popular with Buddhist monks in China, and Eisai brought it into the fold in Japan. Chano-yu is to this day a really important part of Japanese culture. It was developed greatly a few hundred years later by Sen no Rikyu, who was a tea master and sort of philosophical legend in Japan. He cultivated the wabi aspect of it, which is a celebration of sort of rustic simplicity within beauty. Rikyu's lead disciple once wrote, "To delight in the refined splendor of a dwelling or taste the delicacies belongs to the worldly life. There is shelter enough when the roof does not leak, food enough when it staves off hunger. This is the Buddhist teaching and the fundamental meaning of Chano-yu." So there you go. Rikyu was kind of a legend. He had a great sensibility for working with people. His early master Takenojo imparted these values into him and taught him everything he knew. And Rikyu took to it like a moth to flame, is that the term? There's a famous anecdote where Joe tells him basically to sweep the garden before a tea ceremony. And then Rikyu goes out there and he notices that the garden has been swept up completely. It's completely clean and spotless. And instantly, he recognizes what his master wants and shakes a tree so that a couple of leaves fall to the ground, which it said pleased Takenojo very much. Now, Rikyu became a great advisor to Oda Nobunaga and then his eventual successor after Nobunaga was couped, which was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. They really benefited from Rikyu's ability to host tea ceremonies because this became a venue through which they could do a lot of politics. This is what they called tea diplomacy. And a lot of the tendencies for the ruling class was to have these tea ceremonies that were very gaudy and covered in jewels and gold and stuff like that. Whereas Rikyu, who was apt at doing that, in his downtime went more and more towards mastering the craft of a wabi within the tea ceremony. One day he actually designed a tea house overlooking the Yodo River called Tai'an. It's still apparently a vaunted location in Japan to this day. But all good things come to an end at some point. Apparently Rikyu, for whatever reason, it's kind of not clear from the historical record, but he seemed to have undermined the authority of Hideyoshi in some way. Maybe he was just cultivating too much of a influence on his own that was quite unique from the empire. And so Hideyoshi sentences him to seppuku, to death. Cut out your entrails. Before his death, Rikyu is cool as ever. He hosts a tea ceremony for his disciples and he writes these two poems, one in Chinese and one in Japanese. The Chinese one says, 70 years of life. Ha ha, and what a fuss. With this sacred sword of mine, both Buddhas and patriarchs I kill. Interesting. And the second in Japanese, now my girded sword, that upon my armed side, hitherto I've worn, draw I forth and brandishing, fling it in the face of heaven. To me, the early history of tea in East Asia is one of this duality, this dialectic, one might say, between a practicality of consuming something to gain energy, as well as an impracticality of cultivating it to the highest extent at some point. But more importantly, maybe there's this other duality between a humble simplicity with tea and this affluent sophistication of being a tea drinker. And these two things kind of carry on to this day in how we think about tea. There's something very humble and very spiritually pure and cleansing about it, and simple and non-toxic. And then at the same time, there's a lot of class-based baggage about it. It was something emperors could use to flaunt their elegance, and it was also something that Buddhist monks could easily take with them on their ascetic journeys. And in that way, tea can be tied to the most noble parts of humanity and also some of the most crude and unnecessary suffering in the world. As China and India, under different empires, expanded more and more and began to make contact with the rest of the world, we can see this dynamic play out, especially when talking about these nations and their relationship to Great Britain. Let's have a cup of tea. So, British colonization. What do you think about that? The history of Britain's relationships to China and India are very complex. I'm going to try to keep it about tea, but I'm going to fail. But at the same time, it's really important to talk about the context. The first thing we'll talk about is the big name behind it all, in a way, the British East India Company. At the dawn of the 17th century, multiple European powers all found themselves very interested in maritime exploration and discovering, exploring, and potentially exploiting Asia and, of course, other parts of the world. The British East India Company was the biggest one. Now, back in the day, business interests and robbery and political interests were even more bluntly tied together than they are now, if you can believe it. Francis Drake's famous or infamous circumnavigation of 1577 had a huge impact on global trade. In particular, England and Spain had some beef, and Francis Drake found a way to convince the crown to give him a bunch of money to go on a trip around the world, which would include him going to South America, the Americas, and robbing gold and other treasures from Spanish colonies and ships. So he did that. And he got a bunch of stuff because the Spanish were not paying much attention. And then he sneakily took that stuff, went to Indonesia as part of his travels, traded some of the treasures for cloves, which at first he didn't realize were actually very valuable, and then came home and brought home a huge fortune to the British Empire. So he got rich, the Queen got rich, yay. What got me stuck at first understanding this story is framing the way in which public versus private interests are figured in this story. Public versus private is anachronistic even. It's not something that you would have described things as back in that time. But what I'm referring to is it the state or is it a bunch of business people? Because we kind of recognize those things as separate, and yet something like Francis Drake's expedition was actually a mix of both. And it was a very sneaky mix of both, which was done intentionally with the guises of being a private affair of a bunch of privateers to steal stuff from another nation without it being directly tied to the British Empire so as not to start a war. In essence, it was a bunch of pirates. It was a bunch of pirates that the crown was paying to steal stuff. And it worked. And as it turns out, the beginnings of European imperialism often looked very much like this. As written by H.P. Krauss, these joint venture companies, partnerships, or associations were a common method of organizing and financing commercial voyages, military expeditions, and colonizing activities from the Middle Ages onwards. Now, this is important context for the British East India Company for the following reasons. For one, the Kingdom of England, ruled by Elizabeth I, had this beef with Spain, right? It all started, well, who knows when it started, but basically we can pin it to the Treaty of Tordesillas, in which Spain and Portugal, the Iberian neighbors, laid claim to a bunch of territory in the New World, and a bunch of European powers were not necessarily in line with that, particularly the English. There's also a very distinct split between the two because, of course, England had the Protestant Reformation and the Church of England, which eventually Elizabeth would decree would be ruled by the ruler of England. Her. She was the leader of the church in England. The Spanish, on the other hand, were not happy with that. Demasiado infeliz. Enojado. So all this catalyzes the violent competition that would take place between the European powers over non-Europe places. Drake was a pioneer in what turned out to be this kind of movement in English history of tons of maritime expeditions that were based in getting sailors to steal stuff from Spanish and Portuguese ships. This notably included the Madre de Dios, which was chock full of exotic treasures and valuable information. According to researcher Rogério Miguel Puga, the Portuguese profitable trade with the Far East became a subject of interest for the English nation, especially after the takeover of the carrack Madre de Dios, Mar de Dios, near the Azores by Sir John Burrough in 1592, during an expedition to the West Indies 18. No, I didn't mean to say 18. I just forgot to take out the citations. Aboard were exotic and extremely profitable commodities, which overwhelmed England, and manuscripts containing information which the English translated and used for their own benefit, as Hakluyt mentions while informing the reader of how Japan and China became to be a more familiar land for Elizabethans, who also desired to sell their cloth to the emperor's subjects. Basically, they stole a bunch of ships. They stole this one ship that had a lot of good shit on it. And it also had a lot of directions for how to go to that particular area where all the good shit was. So, as this expedition movement was taking place, a bunch of merchants and rich people, semi-rich people, got together and were like, let's make a company where we pay people to go out and expedition over there. And so this leads to, in 1600, the formation of the East India Company by business people, merchants, politicians, sailors, pirates, to build a company that would expedition out to East Asia and the Indies and figure out where the treasure is and either steal it from other Europeans or steal it from the Asians or trade for it. Yay. At that time, the Dutch East India Company was doing work, particularly in the early years of the British East India Company. It was a bit slow, but eventually they would eclipse the Dutch and the Portuguese before them. The Portuguese, remember, were tied into Asia. They had all the good stuff from Asia. The Dutch and Portuguese had mixed relations when it came to the maritime stuff, the trade stuff. So eventually England's journey was to try to figure out what to do, like how to get to those places, how to get those routes, and then how to get those officials and get those trades and figure out what other trades they could do. And so begin the adventures of one of the most brutal and capitalistic entities in human history. Right, this is about tea. Speaking of the Portuguese, Elizabeth I dies, and there's a bit of a crisis because she has no heirs. They smoothly carry out the succession to James, her cousin, although there's a lot of controversy about it. And James is kind of chill, but after like 2 decades, then Charles I becomes king. And Charles I was not a popular guy. He was very adamant about the divine right of kings and about the fact that whatever he says goes, and he had absolute power. And the parliamentarians, you know, the people who believed that politicians should decide stuff, were very mad about this, and so broke out an English civil war in which the parliamentarians won. And so Oliver Cromwell, leader of the parliamentarians, becomes the, what do they call him? The something head of the Commonwealth. It doesn't matter. Eventually Oliver Cromwell dies and his son is not as convincing. And so England decides basically like, you know what, we're tired of this Commonwealth thing. After all, we're going to just go back to the monarchy. So they depose the son of Oliver Cromwell, whatever his name is, and Charles II comes to the throne. And he's brought to the throne in part with the help of the Portuguese, who used England's help in battle to actually regain their independence from Spain. Family drama. So the restoration happens and Spain and Portugal are beefing over who will be the wife of Charles II. They want to build a sort of stronger allyship with England for political purposes, of course. Portugal wins out. They bring Bombay to England. We'll talk about that in a bit. And they also bring Catherine of Braganza to be the wife of Charles II. And this is important because Catherine of Braganza loved tea. And it's also important because it helped bring English and Spanish tension to a head because they didn't hate each other enough. This led to England's participation in Portugal's war for independence with Spain, which Portugal won. And remember, Portugal, they had Bombay, they had been doing dealings in Asia for many years. England would know because they stole one of their ships and found out some of the routes. And this was a huge asset that would only help the company do more and more dealings. Portugal, for example, knew to trade with China only in Canton, which we'll talk about in a bit. But also, Catherine of Braganza liking tea was important. She was one of the people who helped popularize tea drinking in England, especially among women. Tea had been consumed here and there by English people since the EIC's inception. There's a record from an Englishman, the earliest recorded mention of tea from the English. It was an EIC agent asking a co-worker in Macau for the finest sort of cha. There's the cha again. But prior to Catherine's endorsement of it as this cool beverage, mostly it was seen as a medicinal thing. That was how it was sold to potential upper-class customers. A newspaper advert from 1658 announced, "That excellent and by all physicians approved China drink, called by the Chinese cha, by other nations te, alias tea, sold at the Sultaness Head, Ye Coffee House in Sweeten's Rents, by the Royal Exchange, London." I have no idea why I used that accent. No idea. That's an American accent, old-timey. But, you know, it was character. It built character. And so, particularly the early 1700s was the time period in which England starts to finally drink tea more often. And this was a bit of a problem because England still hadn't figured out how to get tea. Like, they were getting it from the Dutch. but that was expensive. Only through finally getting contact with Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou, were they able to start trading with Chinese officials there, because China had basically a ban on trading with foreign powers other than Russia, which is a bit complicated. Just for reference, Ellis, Mauger, and Coulton's book Empire of Tea notes that over 200,000 pounds of tea were imported from China in the 5-year period 1700 to 1704. Though dwarfed by the quantities imported in later decades, this must nevertheless have been reckoned a vast amount, given that less than 150,000 pounds had been shipped in total prior to 1700. This was central in the beef between the British and Dutch East India companies. 100 years earlier, they learned what the Portuguese learned before them, that the way to do trade in China was to go to Canton, which was the only place, feasibly, that you could find officials who were not cooperating with the hygiene or the ban on foreign trade. This ban existed in China for many years. It went back to the 14th century, the Ming Dynasty, and it was never popular, didn't really work like most prohibitions because it just enforced more people to smuggle and do piracy and be rebellious. But it was an effort to sort of restrict trade and some type of interferences from Japan and other foreign powers. So Canton officials didn't really follow these regulations at all. And when the Portuguese arrived there in the 16th century, they set up a cute little thing where they would take stuff that they would get from Canton, like silks, and then bring it over to Japan. And in turn, Japan would give them a bunch of stuff. A small fortune. And so the Dutch East India Company was essentially formed so that the Dutch could have some sort of larger merchant entity that could potentially finally trade with China. And so it eventually happened. They set up a base in Indonesia, in Jakarta, which was how they would intend to do things. But the trade was always slow. It was always slow with China because of all the restrictions. There were a bunch of skirmishes between the Dutch and the Chinese over the Penghu Islands, Taiwan and stuff. It's a whole thing. But yeah, basically the Dutch and the Portuguese were early on tea. They got it, but it was always slow and expensive. And so the English ran into this. In order to understand how Britain goes from being on the outside of this already tenuous trade in Europe between Europeans and China for tea and many other goods, we have to talk about the year 1757. Two things that are really important happened in 1757. The first is the official passage of what's called the Canton system. So like I said, the trade is generally happening in Canton when it's happening, and it's not happening very much. Traders are not very interested in going to other ports in China, like Zhejiang at first, because there's barely anything set up to handle that stuff at all. Canton was the only place where you could also find officials who were corrupt enough not to follow the regulations, but also organized enough to set up establishments through which they could do this stuff in an orderly fashion. So everybody just wanted to go to Canton anyway. What this means for the people in Canton, specifically the people who are benefiting monetarily from this position, is that they were rich and they were corrupt as hell. They were very intent on maintaining and developing the power that they were getting from this situation. Canton also has this very awkward location, which is part of why it was hard to find at first and why European powers generally would try other ports first, because Canton is located at the top of this riverbed, right? There's the Pearl River and then there's Canton River that goes right into Canton. It makes like this V around what starts with like Macau here, and there's a bunch of territory around it. So it's a narrow body of water. And this is actually fairly convenient when it comes to the Canton system, which is the government deciding that all trade would exclusively go through Canton, because if you had to travel through that narrow body of water, it would be pretty easy to surveil you coming in through there. That plus the fact that Canton had this stuff set up and it had easy travel to the northern and inner parts of China, relatively easy, that made it an ideal commercial center of the nation. Gang Zhao, in his book Qing Opening to the Ocean, writes, from 1687 to 1755, annual customs revenues in Guangdong increased from little more than 90,000 ounces of silver to more than 500,000. And since Guangzhou was the main conduit through which flowed exotic goods, such as clocks, that emperors favored, provincial officials had a way to please the emperor and reinforce their own positions. Any challenge to the central position of Guangzhou in overseas trade had to confront strong resistance. So as you can see, this is leading these notably law-breaking Canton officials to become more and more emboldened. And this made them harder and harder to trade with for the European powers because they were in such a position of power they could say fuck you to anybody. These officials developed such a bad reputation and seemed such a nuisance to conducting orderly business and getting a good amount of profit that these Europeans eventually figured, we're gonna go try another port again. Something's gotta be better than this. So they started looking northward to the city of Ningbo. And at that time, the city of Ningbo was kind of pleased about it. The emperor, Qianlong Emperor, was actually highly welcoming of this foreign trade in Ningbo, which was punctuated by the arrival of English merchants there in 1755. But just a year later, his tune had changed dramatically. And so in 1757, the Canton system begins. He decrees that all trade must pass through Canton, saying Ningbo is the same as Macau in terms of developing overseas trade. But if we open the port, it will lead more and more foreigners to make their homes in the interior, which is a strategic area. This is not consistent with our principle of eradicating all problems at the earliest opportunity. We shall confine the foreigners to Guangzhou and will not allow them to come to Ningbo. I believe that the frequent appearance of foreign ships in Zhejiang must be connected with the conniving of sinister local brokers. You must watch them very carefully. You must put an end to the construction of commercial offices and churches by these sinister local brokers. What changed? Well, aside from the fact that the Canton officials, the Canton lobby probably got to him, there were also a myriad of other issues that were confronting Qianlong Emperor that caused him to have a lot of worry. Particularly, as Zhao writes, his desire for Western goods and ideas, the unemployment problems in Guangdong, and the question of security. The Canton system ended up being a big success, but also not, because for one, it allowed for a more orderly way of doing trade officially, and allowed for China's empire to focus a lot more on regulating what was going on in Canton to the best of their ability. It became a source of a huge rise in tea imports in Europe, but also, according to a lot of scholarship and public opinion, it was kind of what set the stage for China's collapse at the hands of European powers. How could this be? How could it be that China was both becoming more profitable and successful and also more and more unstable and unsuccessful at the same time? The answer to me is related heavily with the other big thing that happens in 1757, the Battle of Plassey. Put more water in this tea cup. It's basically just water now. So, this video is about tea. I just realized that. So, let's talk about tea for a second. Today, chai is a staple of Indian life. Chai tea, which as Pavitr Prabhakar deftly notes, means tea and is redundant, becomes a huge worldwide export, something that people consume all over America and different parts of the West and the world. And it also has a cultural foothold as this beverage that greets Indians every day, especially in the morning. But for most of history, even though the tea plant grows indigenously in Assam, a part of India, Indians didn't really drink tea. Scholar Philip Luckendorf writes, but my and their assumption that tea had a long history on the subcontinent was incorrect. When after many years I learned how recent a development this cherished habit was, I decided to research the process of its promotion and gradual adoption, a phenomenon largely confined to the latter 2/3 of the 20th century. In the course of my fieldwork, I was often asked, with genuine bewilderment, but what did we drink before? Answers to this question, obtained largely in interviews with elderly people, referenced a range of regional and seasonal milk, water, and fruit juice-based beverages, nearly all of which can still be found, but most of which are more costly and less easily prepared than chai. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Indians didn't drink hot water infused with stuff. Everybody did that. Vedic Indo-Aryans who came to the Indian subcontinent in the Bronze Age, so 3,000 years ago or so, 4,000, had a ritual drink called soma, which is referenced in the Bhagavad Gita. It was a kind of sacrifice to the gods that involved the juice of a plant, which was never identified. This is kind of like an ancestor of tea, and there are many of these everywhere. But as far as tea proper, it's not so simple. There's some record of a Dutch merchant saying that people used tea in the 1500s, but not much around that to clarify, to back it up. There's also the fact that the real pioneers of Indian tea are indigenous groups from the area, namely the Singpol as well as the Kamti, who are much less credited. They're a much smaller group. But the Singpo in particular are people who have been using tea leaves for a very long time and were very influential to what would become Indian tea. So how does India become a tea production powerhouse? How does tea become a big deal in India? Imperialism. That's how. So after a slow first few years, the British East India Company ends up becoming very successful in the Indies through particularly a trade of jewels, pepper, textiles, and saltpeter. William Dalrymple, in his book The Anarchy, which chronicles the destructive rise of the EIC, notes the company's balance sheets grew increasingly profitable, so much so that investors from around Europe began for the first time queuing up to buy EIC stock. In 1613, the subscription for the first joint stock raised 418,000 sterling. 4 years later, in 1617, the subscription to the second stock pulled in a massive 1.6 million sterling, turning the EIC for the first time into a financial colossus, at least by English standards. 1.6 million sterling at that time is basically like 100 million now. There is record of a English priest named John Ovington in 1689 who reported seeing Indians consuming tea. He said, a common drink with all the inhabitants of India, as well as Europeans and natives. But it was because he was on a voyage to Surat and he was reporting on Surat. And Surat was this port city which was intermingling with all of these rich people, a lot of merchants because it's a port city. And they brought in tea as this kind of exotic beverage, herb from China. By that point, the company had already established multiple settlements in India. The first was in Madras, modern-day Chennai. The second was Bombay, or Mumbai, which they got from the crown because the crown got it from Portugal, remember? So they were making money, but they were having a lot of conflicts with the Mughals. The Mughals were super powerful, and the Mughals had a huge military power. They were unfuckwithable. And the Brits at one point tried to have a military skirmish in the late 1600s with the Mughals and failed epically. That was called the First Anglo-Mughal War. Dalrymple writes, the Mughal war machine swept away the English landing parties as easily as if it were swatting flies. Soon the EIC factories at Hooghly, Patna, Kasimbasar, Masulipatnam, and Visakhapatnam had all been seized and plundered, and the English had been expelled completely from Bengal. It was a huge embarrassment. It took a bunch of ass-kissing and begging for them to be able to reestablish in Bombay and for them to start to try their hands at settling in Bengal. Eventually, they made a small settlement in Kolkata, at that time Calcutta, which became huge for them. At that time, Bengal was one of the richest places in the world. To have a settlement there to do trade was a huge boon. In particular, certain crops grew abundantly, and there was a ton of great textile work, the best in the world maybe. Now, at the start of the 18th century, the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb dies. And by the end of his life, he had already kind of messed things up because even though he had a very successful and powerful reign for the Mughals, he expanded too much and created too much conflict with different groups outside of the empire and also within the empire. To make matters worse, there was a succession crisis, which, more internal conflict. This is happening at the same time that the English are becoming more and more rich and powerful within India. And of course, as military technologies advance more and more, which the Europeans always took advantage of. So the East India Company was primed in the face of an escalating conflict with the French that would lead to the 7 Years' War to put an end to Mughal reign in India and begin their domination. France plays a part here. France actually had their own East India Company, of course, like other European powers. After years of skirmishes between the English and the French, as well as the English and the Mughals over the Indian subcontinent, in 1757, the Battle of Plassey took place. On one side, you had the British East India Company, led by Robert Clive, who was an interesting character, and on the other side, you had the Mughals, led by Siraj ad-Dawla, who was also a very interesting character. Both of them miscreants, just miscreants. The Mughals were also aided by some French troops. Siraj ad-Dawla had violently besieged the Calcutta base for the English East India Company a few months prior. They scrambled to get it back, and then there were a bunch of more skirmishes over other bases until this moment. The Mughals vastly outnumbered the English, especially with the help of some of the French. But the English won this time. They benefited from many of Siraj ad-Dawla's allies turning against him because the guy was not a good guy. He wasn't a good guy. Dalrymple writes, the bankers and merchants of Bengal who sustained Siraj ad-Dawla's regime had finally turned against him and united with the disaffected parts of his own military. Now they sought to bring in the mercenary troops of the East India Company to help depose him. This was something quite new in Indian history, a group of Indian financiers plotting with an international trading corporation to use its own private security force to overthrow a regime they saw threatening the income they earned from trade. Alongside these Indian financiers and allying with the English company was Mir Jafar, who to this day is a cursed name among Desis in India. It is not a thing you call a person unless you want to call them a severe traitor. Mir Jafar turned his back on Siraj ad-Dawla. Again, not a great guy, but he did it with intentions of becoming the prince, the Nawab, and he was made the Nawab. In exchange, he gave a huge amount of money to Robert Clive and the English, and thus began a reign of terror of the English in Bengal that would cause the Bengal region to, at a time period, be completely depleted, it seemed, of land resources, and much worse. Bengal, as well as Bihar, which they also won in that battle, were both these thriving economic places that became devastated by a massive famine in 1770 that ended up taking the lives of conservatively like 10 million people. It was about a fifth of the population, and many of the resources were depleted because the English didn't take care of them. They didn't really care about the human cost at all. Of course, the famine was started by rains. It's not as if the English came up with the famine by themselves, but they exacerbated the problem so much in a way that Indian rule hadn't done in a very long time because they were prepared for these kinds of famines. They were prepared to have sort of social safety nets, you could say. The English did not care because this region was operated by a company. It was a company, a bunch of capitalists, and the only thing that they focused on in the midst of this terrible thing was extracting more and more money from these dying people. As all of these people were suffering and dying, the East India Company focused on increasing their profits from tax collection, especially because business was drying up and war isn't cheap, you know? In fact, many company workers saw this as an opportunity. There's a report of one person, who is not the only example, who multiplied his worth by like 60 because he was upselling rice. He bought rice on the cheap and then sold it for extremely high cost because people were starving. In Europe, the many who had been invested in the company didn't sense that anything was wrong at first because the ledger was fine. They had overcome somehow losing all of this business by extracting taxes at a horrible rate. So the East India Company looked good as ever at first. And then news got out. Word got out about the famine. The Whig politician and writer Horace Walpole quipped that they had outdone the Spaniards in Peru. They'd murdered, deposed, plundered, usurped. The London Post and other publications soon started publishing exposés about the company's crimes. This, combined with the fact that they had destroyed the land value in this extremely valuable territory, and also a lot of their workers died, and their labor force also that wasn't dead often was not very able to work because, famine, and because they were in huge debt, because of course they were borrowing millions and millions of pounds to finance even more business expansion. After a little while, the East India Company's stock plummeted. There was a huge credit crisis in Britain in the early 1770s. Dalrymple writes, it was widely recognized for the first time that the EIC was incapable of reforming its own affairs, and that unless Parliament intervened, Bengal and its vast revenues would be lost. Now, tea. This is actually really relevant to tea, this situation, because for one, this situation with the company led to the passage of the Tea Act in the American colonies, which placed no tariffs actually allowed basically free importation from the British East India Company of tea into the Americas because they had this huge stockpile of tea and were not making money from anything. And at the same time, they were taxing the American colonists for purchasing the tea. They were also undermined in their smuggling tea operations, so that cost them even more money in that sense, and that led to the Boston Tea Party, in which the Patriots, these American revolutionaries, jumped a bunch of ships and dumped 90,000 pounds of tea from the East India Company into the Boston harbor. The revolutionaries, by the way, heard, like everyone else, about the atrocities in Bengal, and that was extra motivation for them. Maybe not because they felt so bad for the poor Indian folk, but because they were like, we don't want to end up like that. The second way that this is relevant to tea is a bit more lengthy, again, I'm sorry, is because this disaster with the company paved the way for parliamentary control over British India. First, through this kind of council that was formed, led by Warren Hastings, who was, he was one of those guys. He was one of the company guys, but he was also a lot more sensitive to the Indians. He learned a bunch of Indian languages. He was learning to write in Sanskrit. He had spoken often about India being a second home to him. And he generally also understood that in order for a business to make money, you had to not kill all of the people that you were making money from. So he immediately instituted a bunch of reforms in Bengal, including unifying currency and a bunch of other stuff that led to the rejuvenation of the Bengal economy, which was in parts this agriculture. The rice came back because they planted it. The British East India Company wasn't planting it before for some reason. And this also included the planting of sugar and opium. Now, sugar is particularly relevant for tea in an obvious way because, especially through the British, sugar becomes a thing you take with tea. Tea is bitter. The British are like, let's put sugar in it. So it becomes this huge thing, and it's a big cash crop in general because people were using sugar for everything, and they were trading it from all over the world, including through the Atlantic slave trade, through the trade with the Caribbean. But this was also really important because of the opium part. The opium part is more what I want to focus on. Because what happens with the opium is that it is hugely demanded around the world, really, but it's also particularly demanded in China. China has a ban on opium, actually, which so far, China and bans of things has been going super well. And likewise, the China ban on opium did not do anything to really stop the smuggling of opium into China. And in fact, Britain made a huge fortune. Well, the British East India Company made a huge fortune trading to private merchants some opium, which they would bring to China, and those private merchants would give them silver. So they weren't really trading into China necessarily. But yeah, they were smuggling opium into China, and in return, they were getting tea. They would buy tea with the profits that they would get. And this was really important because the British people just kept drinking tea. Like, it just kept going on and on. So this is sort of what builds the early 1800s. And yeah, of course, there's a lot of stuff in between, but I know you don't want me to go longer. You don't want me to go longer. Opium poppy had been grown in India before, but Britain basically took it to the next level because of course they did. They established a monopoly of all the opium produced in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, according to this United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Peace article thing. And so this forms what we know as a triangular trade. The triangular trade between Britain, China, and India, where they would take the profit from Indian opium and use it to buy tea from China, and then they would use that profit to make more opium, which they would sell to China, which they would use, and they would go on, and they made a huge fortune. The Auditor General of the EIC in 1830 said, India does entirely depend upon the profits of the China trade. Now, at this point, there's so many merchants that wants to partake in this trade, and with all the restrictions that having one company monopolizing this trade forms, in addition to the restrictions from the Qing Empire, there is a break of the monopoly, and a bunch of English merchants show up to the shores of Canton, and the trade continues farther and farther, and this ended up being a big economic problem for China. Hoh and Mair write, from 1828 to 1836, China ran up a trade deficit of $38 million, largely due to the illegal opium trade, which dramatically turned the tide of silver from China to Britain. Despite pleas by some in the government, some officials, to reduce or end the ban on opium so that China could have some more agency in this trade, which was always going to happen, the Daoguang emperor said no, he was morally outraged, and he began to enforce the ban harsher, leading the Chinese government to confiscate opium from merchants violently, a lot, and threaten them with death sentences, which became the perfect excuse for Britain to go to war with China. And this is the first Opium War. The first Opium War ends pretty quickly. Britain dominates. It's hardly a match because Britain has so much advancement in riches and military technology at this point. And at that point, they're probably waiting to invoke some rage on China because of how frustrated they had been that China was so restrictive with their trade policies and yada yada. They easily seized the port towns of Chusan and Ningbo. The Canton system was over. As Hoh and Mair write, with its defeat in the Opium Wars, China's doors were forced open, opium flooded across its borders, and the country descended into more than a century of economic hardship, social disintegration, foreign invasions, civil war, revolution, and the collapse of the country's ancient tea industry. Britain's victory allowed them to strong-arm China into giving them Hong Kong, into making them a most favored nation with China, and to trade at 5 different ports. And this was the beginning of Britain asserting imperialistic dominance over China, and a lot of Chinese scholars point to this as the beginning of a huge period of humiliation for the Chinese that ended up ending the Chinese Empire. At the same time, Britain has this idea to say, you know what? Maybe we should grow tea ourselves, because we have this whole colony here in India that has an entire region wherein the plant is indigenous. Although at first they're kind of wary about the people there and their ability to cultivate it correctly and the differences. And they're sorting that out over a period of years. But right around when the first Opium War ends, they're really ready to launch business into this. And that is the beginning of tea being cultivated in India. The thing was, at that time, Britain was not sure how they were going to get the labor. There was a lot of labor power required to produce tea at this massive scale, which would be cheaper, obviously, because they produced it themselves and they make huge profits, and also be able to supply it to all the tea demand in their country. And also, this would end up ruining China because this is like their biggest export. It's tea. And this leads to China falling off the map for a while in terms of being an international producer of tea. As Andrew Liu describes in his book Tea War, this leads to Britain, in need of labor power, creating a very exploitative plantation system in order to cultivate these tea gardens. Starting in 1865, officials in India devised a system of regulated labor recruitment and penal contract employment for the Assam tea industry. It featured the restriction of worker movement, constant surveillance, and wages fixed by law rather than by the market. Penal contract laws provided planters with both a subordinated migrant workforce and the legal impunity to intensify the production process. Politically, indenture was controversial due to its resemblance to African chattel slavery. It was unquestionably unfree by modern standards. Commercially, however, it was a dazzling success. During the last 3 decades of the century, as hundreds of thousands of workers were brought into the eastern Indian plantations, British planters opened up 170,000 more acres of land, and tea production skyrocketed to 60 million more pounds per year. By the turn of the century, Indian tea exports had surpassed those of their Chinese rivals, and the industry had become the leader in world production. Now, masala chai, the tea itself, which is famous for coming from India, actually originates in a kind of ambiguous way, probably in the early 20th century, because at that point, India started becoming themselves a consumer of tea. There was many rebellions. There was a big rebellion from India against Britain and the British Raj, and a series of conflicts that were occurring. But at the same time, companies got a company. Lipton was a notable company. It was formed by a British man in the late 1800s, which started building these campaigns of advertisements in India to sell them on the idea that it would be healthy. Tea's healthy, got health benefits, and it makes you look cool, and it's great. And despite the fact that there was some political resistance and also not a lot of takers at first, this campaign persisted, and this is part of how India consumes more and more tea. As Alex Downs, this tea enthusiast, writes for Serious Eats, Indians quickly developed their own techniques. Instead of steeping tea leaves in boiled water, they boiled them directly in water or milk. To make its consumption more economical, people often used fragmented or ground tea leaves. Together, these practices conserved tea and produced a stronger, more caffeinated brew. While Indians adopted the British affection for adding milk and sugar, they increased the amounts to offset the strength of the boiled tea made from ground up tea leaves. Reflecting local tastes, tea sellers boiled the tea with aromatics such as fresh ginger, cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, and bay leaves. While the exact origins of modern masala chai are unclear, it likely grew out of these early tea preparations. Alongside these preparations, eventually arose the famous chai walas of India, who are street tea sellers. They're a very kind of important part of Indian culture, very iconic. And yeah, this is the nature of colonialism. You know, there's a theory from Homi Bhabha, a term that he uses called hybridity, and I'm not the most intelligent when it comes to post-colonial theory, but it's a fascinating theory that we kind of think about when it comes to being colonized subjects or oppressed peoples, just doing our thing, living, producing culture, and enjoying culture, because you're intaking the impositions and the oppressions embedded within these cultural elements from the colonizer, but at the same time, you're transforming them, and you're allowing these things to exist as if they have not had this history. You're playing ball, but not playing ball. It's something like that. Again, I don't know that much. Baba says at the end of his big book about this, we must not merely change the narratives of our histories, but transform our sense of what it means to live, to be in other times and different spaces, both human and historical. So I actually have a big chapter here about a different type of tea, but this has been going too long, and even my cat is growing restless, as you can see. So if you like this video, let me know in the comment section. It's a bit different from what we usually do here. And if you'd like to see the part 2, which is also going to be about colonialism and stuff like that, let me know. And maybe one day I'll record it and release it. I'm really tired and sweaty. It's really hot. So I'm going to shower and go to sleep. But I hope the tea was good or something like that.